back. This is Jana. This week we're talking about blocking. All that means is that when you're finished knitting, you're going to get your garment or your piece, you're going to get your finished item damp usually, or actually all the way soaking wet. You're going to dry it and you're going to press it into the shape that you want it to be when it's dry. And so this is really helpful, particularly if you're knitting lace or you're knitting things that don't really look like what the finished object's going to be. For example, this shawl, when I knitted this, it was, it was pretty wrinkled up like this, but when I blocked it, it opened out and then you were able to see the pattern. So I have a piece that I'm going to show you today. This is a rectangle that I'm making for a whole different Afghan, and it's kind of a modular thing. Some of the pieces are long and thin, some are rectangle, some are actual squares. And so when I've knitted this, it's very curled up on the edges, and it's definitely not the finished size. So knitting tends to stretch quite a bit in terms of row length. Now when you knit cables, that makes, the cables twist and that draws things in. So it's important to block rectangles and squares such as this so that it dries flat, and then I can assemble it more easily and I don't have to be fighting with this rolled edge and that kind of thing. I don't usually block socks. Now I know well, having said that, I do block socks if they're for a gift. Then I will go ahead and get them wet. I actually get them all the way wet. I soak them for 10 or 15 minutes in cool water just in the sink, and then I wring them out. I'll show you how I do this. And then I block them on a form. Like I have actually a plastic placemat that I cut in a sock shape, and I use that because it's plastic, so it's okay if it gets wet. I do have wooden sock blockers that my husband made, and then he put a varathane finish on it, so it's not gonna cause mold to grow in the wood and things like that. So I do block my socks if I'm going to give them as a gift and I want them to be shaped nicely. If they're just for me, then I just wear them. And then after they come out of the wash, I just hang them on my drying rack. I don't ever put my hand knit socks in the dryer. And you probably don't want to either, unless you want to shrink them down for someone. And even though wool says it's Superwash, still going in the dryer with your cotton socks from Target probably isn't going to go well. So having said that, I do block things if it's a sweater or a gift, or mostly anything other than socks. I do block as soon as I'm done knitting it. So okay, I'll show you how I do that. This is pretty cool water. I'm just going to go ahead and put this down in here. This is Superwash wool. However, I still don't agitate it much. I'm just going to go ahead and put this all the way down in here, and I'm going to let it soak for 10 or 15 minutes, and the yarn will bloom. That just means that it's, that it's fluffing up. My sink doesn't, it doesn't seal very well. It's from the 70s. So I have to go and check on it. I swish it around a little bit, and it's not unusual also for the water to be kind of tinged with whatever dye you have going on. My water's starting to look a little blue here. That's okay. Now, a lot of people will add some really mild detergent, and that's okay if you rinse it really well. Because you figure you've been handling this, the piece probably have some oils from your hand, especially a larger piece that you've been working on for a really long time. There's nothing wrong with that. Just don't use a lot and make sure you rinse it well. And again, if it's wool, you don't want to agitate, so you need to be able to rinse it well without agitation. Otherwise, you'll have a felted piece of whatever you're making. All right, all I've done is let the water drain out of this after 10 minutes or so, and I'm just going to gently press as much of the water back out as I can. Okay, I've set that up on a towel, and I'm going to straighten it all out now. I'm not too concerned about getting all the edges unrolled just yet. And then I'm just going to fold the towel over rolling that up and pressing it. And in that way, we can get a lot of that water out. See, that was a lot that came out. Now I'm going to actually use the other end of the towel that's more dry and do that again. Some people will put their piece in the spin cycle of the washer. I don't really like doing that because I think it tends to, you might distort the shape by doing that with the high spinning. I just press the excess water out like this. Now that my piece has been through the sink and being pressed, most of the water pressed out, now I'm just going to use my grid lines here to put down some pins and so that it will dry flat. And if your pattern calls for specific blocking dimensions, then you want to be mindful of that. So anyway, I'm just going to press this out and start adding pins to make it all lay flat so it will dry. All right, I've added all my pins so it can dry flat. And I added a bunch of pins in the middle here too, because as I said in a different video, I have cats that they like to nest right here. And I really don't want my square to become their latest kitty butt mat. I actually had a shawl one time that was a pretty complicated Celtic cabling pattern, and the cats started doing this thing where they clawed up and they pulled stitches to the point where I couldn't ease them back in and actually had to frog it. It was tragic. So be mindful of where you leave your blocking and where you leave your piece, because yeah, sometimes cats are not your friends. The other thing you want to be aware of is, do you have the space to block what you need to block? I had a giant shawl one time, and I needed to put it out I actually took it over to my mother's house, put it in her guest room, and had to have it laid out on a queen-size bed with all my T-pins and blocking wires into a quilt because I just didn't have space that was feline-free in my house in order to do that. And so you need to be mindful of that. This shawl, the Inara wrap, ended up being like 7.5 feet long, and so again I needed to actually put it down on the floor, and I didn't have blocking mats enough to go the distance on that. So I just ended up putting it on a quilt on the floor and pinning it in place there. So you don't have to have the mats. They're super handy, but it isn't necessary. You can use straight sewing pins. You don't have to have all the latest gadgets and whatever. If you're interested in any of those supplies, I can prepare some links down below for you where you can check those out, but it isn't necessary in order to get the job done. I don't have a set of blocking wires, but when I've needed them in the past, I've borrowed them from my mom. It's just simply a slightly flexible, thinner gauge, stiff wire that you can put, like if you were making a semicircular shawl and you wanted to weave that wire in and out, it would hold the shape of that circular shawl, or a triangular shawl that would hold a straight edge that you could, use to put in your T-pins and then draw that out, and it would make it all nice and straight on one side. So blocking wires are helpful as well, particularly for lacework shawls and bigger pieces. So I'll put some resources down below where you can obtain those things if you'd like. As always, I appreciate your support here. Like and subscribe if you find these videos helpful, and check us out over on Patreon also.